She had stopped counting the days. Not because she'd lost track, Veilshan's kind didn't lose track of things like that, their minds were filed and indexed and cross-referenced like military archives, but because somewhere around day 31 in that collapsed mine shaft, counting had started to feel like a kind of cruelty. She had catalogued everything else instead. The weight of the stone above her. The rate at which the emergency oxygen was depleting. The mathematical certainty, precise to 4 decimal places, that no rescue would come in time. She had made peace with it. And, then, she smelled something. Not recycled air. Not copper-tinged blood. Not the stale chemical grief of a dying suit. Something warm. Something that had no business existing 40 meters underground with a mountain sitting on top of it. She thought her mind was going. Then, the human said, without looking up from whatever she was doing with her hands, "You're awake. Good. Sit still, this is going to take a minute, and, if you move the rocks shift." Veilshan had faced 3 separate combat deployments, survived a decompression event that killed everyone else in her unit, and once talked a war tribunal out of a summary execution using nothing but a procedural footnote. She was not, as a rule, easily unsettled. The smell of whatever the human was cooking, calm as a woman at a Sunday kitchen, 40 meters underground, in a collapsed mine, with no reason on any god's earth to still be breathing, that unsettled her. This is the record of what happened after. I am required by treaty obligation to note that I have tried, twice, to file this as a standard after-action report. Command sent it back both times. They said it read like fiction. I told them, that is the human's fault. They agreed that this was probably true. The first thing you should understand about Veilshan of the Keth or 4th Expeditionary is that she kept meticulous logs. Not because she was ordered to. Not because the 4th Expeditionary had any particular culture of documentation. If anything, they had a culture of tactical brevity, the kind of culture where you shot first and filed paperwork only if shooting didn't resolve it. No. Veilshan kept logs because her hands needed something to do when her mind was doing the thing it sometimes did, which was spiral inward and eat itself in the dark. The logs were medicinal. A known quantity. Log entry, 0300 hours, suit integrity at 91%, nothing to report. Boring and precise and hers. She was on log entry 47 when the mountain came down. It had been a standard insertion. Or standard enough, the Kethor and the Coalition had been jointly occupying the Drevith mining corridors for 11 weeks by then, a peacekeeping arrangement that mostly consisted of 2 armies standing in proximity and glaring at each other while the actual colonists tried to extract iridium and pretended there wasn't a war happening around their equipment. Veilshan was there in a capacity she described, in her logs, as liaison officer, and, which her direct superior described, when he was feeling charitable, as necessary irritant. She was very good at her job. The job being, manage the humans before the humans managed to get someone killed. It was, in fairness, more complicated than it sounded. The humans assigned to the joint operation were Coalition Marines, 3rd Forward Element, a designation that apparently meant something to them and meant absolutely nothing to Veilshan except that these particular humans had been doing whatever they did, whatever it was that made them like this, for long enough that they'd stopped being easily startled by things that should, by any reasonable metric, be startling. She had watched one of them, a broad-shouldered specialist named Draker, walk directly through a Kethor honor salute formation without altering his path by a single degree, not because he was disrespecting the salute but because he was eating a food substance out of a pouch and reading something on a handheld display and was, she suspected, operating at approximately 40% conscious attention. This was fine, apparently. This was a Tuesday. She had filed 6 cultural friction incident reports in the first 2 weeks. By week 4 she had stopped filing them, not because the friction stopped but because she'd run out of descriptive language that adequately conveyed the human just did something that should have caused an international incident and is now offering me a coffee. The coffee, incidentally, was terrible. She knew because she'd tried it once, in a moment of diplomatic weakness. She had not tried it again. The seismic event hit at 1447 local mine time. Veilshan knew it was a seismic event because she had trained for seismic events. She knew the drill. Her body executed the drill before her mind finished deciding to execute the drill. Lateral brace, cover the suit ports, get below the structural crossbeam and wait for secondary collapse. Her training was excellent. Her training had been running in her muscles for 8 years. Her training, at 14:47 on what had been an otherwise unremarkable Thursday, saved her life. What her training had not accounted for was the depth of the collapse. She woke, this being the charitable interpretation of what happened, since it had more in common with surfacing from a depth that should not be survivable, with 40 meters of fractured stone above her and her suit's oxygen gauge at 67% and declining, and the distinct and clarifying sensation of having bitten through one side of her inner jaw hard enough to taste copper. She ran the numbers before she was fully conscious. She had always been like this, numbers first, sensation second. It was a thing her first unit commander had called a gift and her mother had called a personality problem. Total available oxygen, 67%. Suit consumption rate under rest conditions, 2.1% per hour. Suit consumption rate under active exertion, 4.8% per hour. Available rescue window, approximately 31 hours at rest, 14 if she had to move. She lay very still. She ran the numbers again, in case she'd made an error. She had not made an error. She opened a new log entry and typed entry 48. Collapse event. Estimating burial depth 35 to 50 meters. Structural integrity of immediate cavity appears stable. Current status, alive, functional, and doing the math. She paused. Added, the math is not great. Then, she put the log away and started cataloging the cavity. This was also the training. Know your space. Inventory your resources. Make decisions based on data, not feeling, because feeling at this stage was a luxury she did not have. The cavity was roughly 3 meters by 2 meters, which was generous as catastrophic burial went. The Kethor engineers had apparently built their mine shafts to code, and the crossbeam she'd braced under had held, creating a pocket. Around the pocket, collapsed tunnel. Above the pocket, mountain. Against the far wall, visible in the dim emergency light of her suit, a secondary support column, intact, with the junction box for the mine's tertiary communication relay still attached to it, which was useless because the relay was now buried and there was nothing attached to it on the other end. Also against the far wall, a human. She noticed the human the way you notice something that doesn't fit the pattern of a scene you've already resolved. Her brain had filed the scene as collapsed mine, one occupant, grim arithmetic, and then, the human had simply existed against the math. Wrong data. Rescan. It was a Marine. Female. Coalition third forward element, she could identify the unit patch even under the grime and dust. The Marine was sitting with her back against the secondary column, legs extended, head tilted at what Veilshan initially read as unconscious slump angle but, which, on second read, was closer to thinking. Like a person thinking hard, with their eyes shut, somewhere quieter than this. Alive, was the main thing. Veilshan scanned her, she had bioscan integration in the suit's peripheral sensors, standard issue, and the human was alive, her readings hotter than a Kethor's would be at rest, because humans always ran hot. It was one of the first things the briefing documents mentioned and the last thing you actually adjusted to. Heart rate slightly elevated. Respiration normal. A deep bruise spreading across the left side of her face that Veilshan's medical sensor was tagging with a lot of yellow warning indicators. No suit. Coalition Marines didn't use environmental suits in standard mine insertions, they ran on oxygen recyclers, personal units, clipped to a harness. The recycler on this human was still active, its indicator light a steady green. Alive. Functional, or close to it. Possibly concussed. Veilshan updated log entry 48, correction. 2 occupants. Human Marine. Species note, one of the ones from the joint up, designation third forward. She appears to be taking some kind of inventory in her head? Unclear. Update to follow. She sat with this for a moment. Then, she opened entry 49 and typed, the math is still not great, but there are now 2 sets of supplies to count. Beginning resource audit. She identified her name through the unit ID on the shoulder harness, Corporal Marin Solis, 3rd FWD. Veilshan had not personally worked with Solis. She knew her the way you know most people in a joint operation, by function and by friction, which is to say she knew Solis was the one who kept the communication equipment running and who had once, memorably, repaired a coalition radio array using components she described as just stuff I had in my pockets, a statement that had disturbed Veilshan more the longer she sat with it. What did it mean, just stuff? What was the organizational system of a human's pockets? This had bothered her for 2 weeks and she had never found a satisfying answer. Solis came around approximately 40 minutes after Veilshan did. She did not wake up the way Veilshan expected. There was no disorientation. No blind reaching, no animal panic in the small dark space. She opened her eyes, ran them across the cavity ceiling like she was reading a topographic report, then lowered them to her own hands. Flexed them. Both. Turned them over. Some check Veilshan couldn't read, probably neural. She had heard that coalition medics trained certain assessment movements until they were automatic, the way Kethor soldiers counted breaths before standing. Then, Solis looked at her. "You're the liaison officer," she said. Her voice was even, which bothered Veilshan, because her own voice had been doing something slightly wrong in her chest since she'd woken up, a tight quality she was cataloging as controlled distress and, which she suspected was considerably more obvious than controlled. "Correct," Veilshan said. "Veilshan. 4th Expeditionary." Solis nodded once. Not a greeting, exactly. More like, data received, filed. She looked up at the ceiling again. "How deep?" "My estimation is 35 to 50 meters. I cannot be certain." "Yeah." Solis pulled the recycler unit off her harness and checked the display. Read it, the way Veilshan had read her suit's gauge, just numbers, just the math. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You're O2? 67% when I woke. I have been at rest. Currently 64. Another nod. Still no panic. No expression that Veilshan could identify as fear. Just this steady, flat attention, moving across the problem like a hand moving across a map, touching the relevant points. "What's your draw rate?" 2.1 at rest. 4.8 active. Okay. Solis clipped the recycler back and looked around the cavity. Not frantically. Methodically. Ceiling, floor, the 2 walls, the column, the crossbeam, the junction box. Her eyes stopped on the junction box and stayed there for a second longer than everything else. "Coalition Rescue Protocol will run grid search in expandable radius from last known positions. We're both tagged. Response time from this grid is," she paused. Doing the same math Veilshan had done. "Conservative estimate, 60 hours. I have approximately 30 hours of oxygen at rest." "I know." She stood up, which was when Veilshan got her first full standing read of the situation, which was that Solis was taller than she'd registered while sitting, and that the way she rose from the floor had a quality Veilshan found herself internally noting as she moved like someone who's been in places like this before. Not comfortable. Just calibrated to it. "We'll figure something out. We'll figure something out." Veilshan logged it verbatim, because she could not categorize it. It was not optimism, exactly. Optimism had a texture she recognized, bright, slightly irrational, statistically illiterate. This was not that. This was something else entirely, something that sat under the words like a load-bearing strut, and she didn't have a word for it in Kethor, and she had spent a year now learning Coalition Standard and she didn't have a word for it there either. She opened entry 50 and typed, "The human says we'll figure something out. I don't know what to do with this." She closed the log. She started counting her remaining hours. The human, it turned out, had stuff in her pockets. Veilshan watched it emerge piece by piece over the next 2 hours as Solis moved systematically around the cavity, running her hands along the walls, testing the column, testing the floor, occasionally sitting back on her heels and staring at a piece of debris for longer than seemed warranted. From various sealed compartments in her harness and cargo pockets she produced 2 emergency ration packs, 3 meters of polymer cord, a multi-tool that Veilshan's log described as alarmingly comprehensive, a compressed emergency thermal sheet, and a small canister of something she did not initially identify. What is that? Veilshan asked, when the canister came out. She had been trying not to ask questions. Questions felt like a concession to a hopefulness she wasn't sure she could afford. Camp stove fuel, Solis said. Compressed. You carry camp stove fuel in a mine insertion. Solis looked at her. One of those flat-eyed looks that Veilshan had learned, over 11 weeks, to read as I'm deciding how much energy this explanation deserves. Then, my dad was a wildfire suppression tech. He had a saying. Carry the heat source, worry about the food later. Veilshan logged this. She carries camp stove fuel because of her father. This is filed under illogical inheritance, but I am reconsidering the category. You don't have a camp stove, she said. Not yet, Solis said. By hour 6, Solis had constructed, from the multi-tool, 3 sections of torn harness webbing, the junction box housing she'd dismantled from the column, and a piece of aluminum conduit from the collapsed wall, something that Veilshan's log described as a small heating apparatus. I do not know how to categorize this. It functions. That seems to be the main thing. The canteen Solis used as a base was her own, still half full of water. She set the ration packs, designed to need only warm water to reconstitute, beside the apparatus and looked at Veilshan. I'm going to make us something to eat, she said. Then, I'm going to sleep for 4 hours. Then, I'm going to figure out the junction box. Veilshan stared at her. You should sleep too, Solis added. Lower your O2 draw rate. She is making soup, Veilshan logged, at hour 6.3. In a collapsed mine shaft. I do not know why this is the thing that breaks through the numbness. I have been cataloging my own death for 6 hours. The human is making soup. I need a better category system. The junction box, Solis had explained with the flat matter-of-factness that seemed to be her primary register, was still connected to a secondary hardline that ran down to a lower level of the mine. The lower level might be accessible through a crawl passage Solis had identified in the west wall. The crawl passage might exit into an intact section of tunnel. The intact section might have a working surface relay. The might chain was long and Veilshan had done the probability math on each link and found it uninspiring. Solis had listened to the probability math and said yeah in a way that suggested she agreed with the math and had decided to work on it anyway. The ration pack smelled, when the water hit it, of something Veilshan could only describe as warm and inexplicably human. There was no parallel in Kethor food culture. Kethor military rations were nutrient-optimized and tasted approximately of obligation. This smelled like something had been intentionally made good, even knowing it was going to end up in a foil packet in someone's pocket in a mine. She sat across from the small improvised stove with her suit humming quietly around her, and she watched the human soldier, with a head injury and a 40-hour oxygen window and a mountain on top of her, stir the ration pack with a folded piece of conduit, focused and calm, like this was a Tuesday. The mountain's weight sat above them both. Veilshan opened a new log entry. Entry 51. Hour 6. Human is making food. I cannot account for this. I have been running probability calculations since I woke. The calculations have not improved. The human does not appear to be running probability calculations. She appears to be determining how long the ration needs to soak. I think I do not understand something about how they approach mathematics of this kind. I do not mean the arithmetic. I mean the other kind. She paused. Added, the smell is disorienting. It shouldn't matter. It matters. She didn't close the log. She left it open. The ration pack steamed gently in the dim light, and the mountain did not move, and somewhere above them the rescue teams were running their expanding grid search, and Solis stirred the food and said nothing, and Veilshan watched her and tried to figure out what word she was looking for. It wasn't optimism. It was something older than that. She was still trying to name it when Solis handed her a portion without being asked, and she took it, and the warmth of the container through her suit gloves was startlingly, stupidly real. She ate it. She logged entry 52. They made enough for both of us. She didn't add anything else. The mountain sat above them in the dark, patient as a fact, and the small heat source burned, and the numbers had not changed, and Valshan ate her ration portion and felt, without understanding it and without being able to defend it against any statistical review, something she would spend the next 3 days trying to categorize before giving up and filing it under unknown. Which was where she kept the things the humans kept doing to her. Let me be precise about something. When I describe what Solis did in the 8 hours following the meal, I want to be very clear that I am not editorializing. I am a Kethor officer with 8 years in active service, 3 commendations, and a reputation for what my colleagues generously call rigorous documentation and what my colleagues less generously call pathological note-taking. I am not given to embellishment. I do not dramatize. I log what I observe. What I observed was this. Hour 7. Solis slept. Not the fitful, guilt-edged sleep of someone who knows they should be doing something. The actual sleep of a person who had decided that sleep was the correct tactical action and had executed it with the same flat competence she brought to everything else. For hours, she'd said, and for hours I timed it, because I was not sleeping, I was cataloging the sound of my own oxygen draw and updating my probability calculations every 40 minutes, which is a habit I developed in officer training and which had never previously caused me problems because the calculations had never previously been about my own survival. The calculations at hour 7 were not great. The calculations at hour 7 put my rescue window at intersecting with my oxygen window in a way that required some optimistic assumptions about rescue response time. I had run the numbers with coalition response time variance factored in. Solis, before sleeping, had given me the actual field data on third forward rescue up timelines, and I had incorporated it, and the resulting model was more optimistic than mine had been before she gave it to me, but still functioned as a closed system with a hard ceiling I kept bumping against. I am telling you this so you understand the frame I was working within. I am telling you this because of what Solis did in the 3 hours after she woke up. She woke at exactly 4 hours, no alarm, opened her eyes, and said, "The crawl passage." Not to me, particularly. I think she had been dreaming it. The sleep had been a tool and the tool had been used and now the next tool was the crawl passage. She had already moved toward the west wall before I had fully registered that she was standing. The crawl passage was not a passage, technically. It was a gap between a collapsed section of ceiling material and the intact floor, approximately 60 centimeters high and running along the west wall for, according to Solis's visual estimate, somewhere between 3 and 8 meters before it either opened up or terminated. Either a path out or a cavity dead end. There was no way to determine which without committing to it. I looked at the gap. I looked at Solis. I looked at the gap again. If it terminates, I said, you'll need to reverse out under a compromised ceiling. I know. She was already on her hands and knees, angling the beam of her suit light into the gap, reading what she could from the entrance. If it terminates in the first 3 meters, I reverse. Past 3 meters, the ceiling material shifts composition, I can see it from here. Past the shift point, the structural risk changes. Changes to what? Slightly different. She looked at me over her shoulder, one of those looks. I'm not going to sell you on this, officer. The numbers aren't great. I had not expected her to say that. I had been braced for coalition-style tactical positivity, which I had experienced before and which always felt slightly patronizing, like someone trying to walk you away from a ledge while pretending there's no ledge. There was a ledge. She knew there was a ledge. She had said so. Then, why, I started. Because the junction box is our communication option and the junction box hardline runs into that passage. She had already turned back to the gap. And, because I'm good at this. She said it the way you'd say I'm left-handed or I react badly to soybean protein. Just a fact. No performance. No inflation. I logged it. I didn't know what else to do. Hour 11. Solis is beginning crawl passage exploration. She has assessed the risk, acknowledged it, and proceeded. She says she is good at this. I believe her. I cannot explain why I believe her. Her oxygen supply is not meaningfully different from mine and the passage represents risk with uncertain reward. I believe her anyway.
filing under unknown again. She went in at hour 11.2.
I lay on the cavity floor, turned my suit's bioscan toward the passage, and watched her vitals. She was in the passage for 43 minutes. I know this because I logged every minute of it, entry per minute, because my hands needed something to do and my mind was doing the thing, and the logs were medicinal, and also because if she did not come back I wanted there to be a record. Of what, exactly, I couldn't have told you. A record that someone had gone in. A record that someone had tried. Her heart rate stayed elevated but stable. Her respiration deepened in the way bodies deepen it when they're working in a confined space, the automatic adjustment. I knew the physiology from the briefing documents, which I had read approximately 47 times during the first 2 weeks of joint operation because reading them over and over was not helping, but I kept doing it anyway. Her vitals said, exertion, some pain, left shoulder, probably the injury from the collapse. She had not mentioned it, but the bioscan flagged it, concentration.
Not panic.
Not once, not even when the bioscan registered what I interpreted as a minor shift in the passage structure, a tremor, small, the kind of thing the mind produced constantly in the aftermath of the initial collapse, did her heart rate spike into the territory I would have associated with involuntary fear response. It spiked into the territory I would have associated with a person who felt afraid and breathed through it.
Which is different. I know it's different. I understand the theory.
I had just never watched someone execute it in a space the size of a ventilation shaft with a bruised shoulder and a mountain overhead. At 42 minutes her bioscan moved from stationary with exertion to moving backward.
I sat up.
She emerged feet first, pulling herself out with the efficiency of someone who had thought clearly about how they were going to exit before they committed to the direction. She rolled onto her back, stared at the ceiling, and breathed for approximately 30 seconds.
I did not ask. I waited.
It opens up, she said.
About 4.5 meters in.
There's a secondary cavity bigger than this one, and it's got a structural pillar that's intact.
The hard line runs through it. There's a Combs junction on the pillar. I absorbed this.
That's the good news, she said.
There is bad news.
The cavity is on the other side of a partial collapse that's sitting unstable. To get to the junction you'd have to move through a space that could shift. She turned her head to look at me.
About 60% of your suit's width.
Your suit.
I had a Class 4 environmental suit.
It was not a slender piece of equipment. It was not designed for mine rescue operations. It was designed for a Kethor officer conducting liaison work in a pressurized environment, which meant it was functional, comprehensive, and built with approximately twice the structural tolerancing of what I needed right now.
I fit, she said. Barely. You don't. Silence. I looked at the ceiling. I did the calculation, not the oxygen one, the geometry one. If you go through again, I started. I'd lose the recycler. She was already thinking it, ahead of me. Harness 2, probably. The space is too tight to go through with it on.
I'd need to detach and push them through first. She looked at the ceiling the way she'd looked at everything, all the same face, all the same flat attention, reading the thing for what it actually was. No recycler, I've got about 4 hours on the oxygen I currently have in my suit lining. Coalition suits carry a reserve. That's enough time to reach the junction, make contact, and maybe. Maybe what? Maybe get back to you while you still have O2. She looked at me then. Or get you out through a different route if there is one. I calculated the maybe chain. The probability chain. It was bad. The other option, I said. I start working the surface of the cavity ceiling. There's a section on the east side where the collapsed material is finer, more aggregate, less solid. It might be movable. I'd need your help. And your O2 rate goes up to active exertion draw. Which cuts your window. I calculated that too. Both options were bad. The first option was bad for Solis. The second option was bad for me. I logged hour 12. 2 options. Both involve someone taking on substantially elevated risk. In Kethor tactical doctrine,
This is the point at which command structure determines the distribution of risk. Solis does not appear to be running a command structure assessment.
She appears to be waiting for my input.
I am not sure what to do with this. I am her joint operation counterpart, not her commanding officer. She is not required to defer to me. She is waiting anyway.
I said, "You should not go through the passage without the recycler."
She said, "I know." "Then, I'm telling you the options," she said. "I'm not telling you I'm doing one of them."
I stared at her. She looked back with that flat face, and I recognized something in it suddenly that I had not recognized before, not because it hadn't been there but because I hadn't had the category. It was patience.
Not passive patience.
Active patience, the kind that has done the arithmetic and is waiting for someone else to catch up without making them feel rushed.
She was giving me the information. She was waiting for me to think. I thought for 11 minutes.
I logged the thinking, because I needed the log to think, which is a thing my first unit commander had called a gift and which I had previously agreed with and which I now, at hour 12 in a collapsed mine shaft, was considering reclassifying.
What I had: oxygen at 51%.
Rescue window, 18 hours at rest, approximately 9 at active draw. Rescue response window, variable, but Solis's field data put it at likely within window if the relay contact was made within the next 4 to 6 hours.
Solis's recycler, 4 hours without it.
The passage, navigable by her, not by me. The ceiling aggregate, movable in theory, time-intensive, my O2 rate the limiting factor. What I noticed, Solis had been in that passage twice in the last 12 hours.
Once to identify it. Once to assess it.
She had not asked me before she assessed it. She had done it, then, brought me the information. She had not, in 12 hours, done a single thing she announced before doing it. She had announced only completed things, or decided things, or options that were now clearly bounded. She did not, I logged this at minute 9, she did not perform deliberation. The deliberation happened in her head, or in her sleep, or in the 43 minutes she was face down in a mine shaft, and, by the time she talked to me, the thinking was done and she was giving me the results.
It was efficient.
It was also, I realized at minute 11, a kind of respect. Not the Kethor military respect of forms and deferences, but something more stripped down.
She was not simplifying the problem for me.
She was not protecting me from the bad options. She was giving me everything and trusting me to be able to handle everything, and the trust was so quiet and matter-of-fact that it had taken me 12 hours to see it. I opened a new entry and typed, "She trusts that I can handle the real information."
This should not be notable.
It is notably rare.
Then, I typed, "I think we should work the ceiling." I sent it to her handheld. She read it. She nodded once. She picked up the multi-tool and stood up.
We worked the ceiling for 3 hours.
I will not romanticize this.
It was exhausting, physically and, in ways that went beneath physical, the close-quarters labor of two people in a space too small for the work, constantly re-navigating each other's positioning, constantly recalculating where to apply pressure and where to wait.
My oxygen draw went to active exertion rate.
I watched the gauge drop with the precise, timed regularity of a thing with no opinion about whether I survived. Solis had a technique for the aggregate material: chip at the edges first, not the center, displace the smaller material around the larger pieces, create channels before trying to move mass.
She explained it once, briefly, and then we did it. I copied her method.
She did not supervise or check my work in any way that felt like supervision. If I did it wrong, she would just wordlessly reposition and demonstrate again, no expression, and I would do it again, and eventually I would do it correctly.
At hour 14.8, my suit's oxygen gauge crossed 40%.
I stopped logging in entries and started logging in single sentences, because the writing was slowing me down and I needed my hands.
40%. Still working. 38%. Section CH7 is loose. 35%.
Solis has created a larger channel.
Upper aggregate shifting. Suit is hot. The work is loud. I am trying not to calculate. I was calculating anyway. I could not stop calculating.
8 years of training and the training was running and the training said 35% oxygen means approximately 6 hours of rest, 3 of active exertion, and you have been at active exertion for nearly 3 hours already, and the math stop.
I had not said anything. I had been thinking it.
She was 3 feet away with her back to me, working the upper channel, and she said stop in a flat, certain voice.
I stopped. She turned around. Looked at me with that face.
You're over-gripping the multi-tool, she said.
You've been doing it for 20 minutes.
You're burning more energy than the task needs.
I looked at my hands.
My knuckles, not white the way a human's would be, Kethor have different vascular color expressions, but the equivalent, tight, over-tight, performing the action at twice the force required.
I released. Slightly.
More, she said.
I released more.
It's a scrape, not a punch, she said.
You're not fighting the rock. You're just moving it. She turned back to the channel.
I stood there for a moment with my grip loose and my suit humming and my oxygen at 33%. I logged, she noticed before I noticed.
She corrected me once.
She did not dwell on it.
Then, I went back to work. The breakthrough happened at hour 16.2. Not dramatic.
Not the movie's version. A chunk of aggregate the size of my forearm shifted wrong meaning it fell down instead of outward, and behind it there was a gap and behind the gap there was the faintest movement of different air.
Not outside air. Not fresh air.
Just different air, the kind of different that means there's more space on the other side than there is on yours.
I pressed my suit sensor to it. My suit sensor said, secondary atmosphere detected.
Carbon dioxide elevated but within survivable range.
Possible passage to lower mining level. I turned around.
Solis was watching me. Her face was, I can only describe it as controlled.
The same face it always was.
But the quality of her stillness was different. She was very still in the way a person is still when they are choosing not to react to a thing until they are certain of the thing.
Well, she said.
I said, there's air on the other side.
Her stillness lasted exactly 2 more seconds.
Then, she said, okay.
Just that. Like it was a correct answer on a test. Okay. She picked up the multi-tool. We kept working.
It took another hour and 40 minutes to widen the gap to a traversable passage. An hour and 40 minutes during which my oxygen gauge moved through numbers I had made peace with in a way I was now discovering I hadn't fully made peace with, because each number I'd accepted in the abstract had a specific quality when it became the present number rather than the predicted number, and the quality was real. It was the specific gravity of reality as opposed to calculation.
22% felt very different from thinking about 22%.
Solis did not comment on my gauge. She had her own oxygen concerns, her recycler was not infinite either, and she had been at active exertion for as long as I had. She checked her own readout twice that I saw, both times with the same expression, which was no expression. When the passage was wide enough for us to move through, she did not go first. She looked at me, calculated something quickly, I think it was the suit dimensions versus the passage dimensions, confirming what she'd already estimated, and then, she went through first, turned around, and reached back to guide my suit through the narrowest section. The guiding was practical. A hand on the suit's shoulder joint, a hand on the edge of the passage, directing me through the geometry.
Not comfort. Functional.
I told myself it was functional. I logged it as guidance through restricted passage. I did not log the additional fact, which was that the guiding was also, somehow, the specific and irreversible opposite of alone.
I didn't have a word for that. I went into the unknown file.
The passage opened up and, then, there was more space and, then, there were mine supports that it held, and, there was the corrugated metal flooring of a lower level, and, there was, at the far end of the lower level, past 2 collapsed sections and, a conduit array that had mostly survived the quake, a communications junction box, its light a steady, functional green. Solis walked to it with the same pace she'd walked across every surface since I'd known her. She opened the panel.
She connected her interface unit. She typed a request. She waited. The box returned a signal. She looked at me over her shoulder. Response in approximately 40 minutes, she said. They've got our grid position. I gave them the revised access route. I absorbed this. 40 minutes, I said. Yeah. She sat down with her back against the conduit array. She checked her recycler. She checked mine. She was adding up the same numbers I was adding up. We'll be okay, she said. Not the way she'd said it in the first cavity. That time I hadn't known what to do with it, what category it fit in, whether it was optimism or delusion or something else. I knew now. It wasn't a prediction. It wasn't a claim. It was a choice, the same flat, deliberate choice she made about every action, the same quiet decision to proceed as though the outcome were determined and the only remaining question was what to do next. It wasn't that she believed everything would be fine. It was that she had decided to act in a way consistent with the possibility that it would be, and, then, she had followed through on it with the consistency of someone who does not leave their principles at the door when the arithmetic gets difficult. I had a word for that. I had just never seen it come in that shape before. I logged, entry 74. We have contact. Rescue inbound. Current O2 14%. She says we'll be okay. I believe her again. I am becoming concerned about how readily I believe her. I closed the log. I sat down next to her and we waited, and the communications junction hummed, and somewhere above us the rescue teams were moving through the grid, and my oxygen gauge did not stop declining, and Solis pulled out the second ration pack and looked at it for a moment like she was considering it, then put it away again. Save it, she said. For what? She looked at me with that face. For after, she said. I decided to stop asking questions. I watched the green light of the junction box. I waited. They got to us with 11 minutes left on my gauge. I know this because I was looking at the gauge when the rescue team came through the passage Solis had identified from the south approach, and my gauge said 4%, and then, the first helmet light appeared, and Solis said there they are the way you might announce that a bus had arrived, and I added an entry, 4%. Rescue achieved. Closing log. I did not close the log. I could not seem to stop typing. The extraction took approximately 90 minutes. The rescue team was Coalition First Response, which meant it was mostly human with 2 Kethor medics attached. The joint operation ran a shared medical protocol, which had caused a great deal of procedural friction in the first weeks and, which had subsequently become, in practice, seamless in the way that the things that initially caused the most friction sometimes become seamless once the friction burns off what was unnecessary. The lead medic was a human named Torin who moved through the collapsed section with the proprietary efficiency of someone who spends a lot of time pulling people out of things they should not have survived. He looked at my oxygen gauge when he reached me. He looked at Solis. He said, "You got the junction contact off." It was not a question. 40 minutes ago, she said. 40- he looked at her readout. On this recycler? It does the job. Torin's expression went through several phases. I had enough experience with human facial language to read most of them. The first was technical disbelief, the face of a person who knows the equipment specifications and is doing unwilling arithmetic. The second was something more settled, the face of a person arriving at a conclusion they've arrived at before. The third was a kind of bone-deep affectionate resignation that I didn't have a word for and, which seemed to be specific to the way the humans involved in rescue operations looked at the humans they were rescuing. He put a fresh recycler on her harness without being asked and checked the seal. "You need a scanner," he said. "I know." "Your shoulder." "I know." She stood up. "Can we do it topside?" He looked at her for a moment. The resignation face settled. "Yeah," he said. "We can do it topside. I want to describe coming out of the mind the way it should be described, the way it deserves to be described, because I will not be doing this again and I want to be accurate. I want the log to be accurate about this particular thing." It was late afternoon on the surface.
The Drevith colonies sit in a geography I had previously found aesthetically unremarkable: low hills, scrubby vegetation, the mining infrastructure stacked against the hillsides like an industrial argument that hasn't been resolved yet. I had looked at it for 11 weeks and found it functional. A backdrop. A context. When I came out of the mine, it was late afternoon, and the light was doing the thing that the light on Drevith did when it was low on the horizon, which was coming sideways, and the scrubby vegetation was lit sideways, and everything was very specific and very real in the way that things become specific and real when you have recently been in the process of calculating the probability that you would see them again. I stood at the mine entrance for longer than was tactically necessary. Nobody said anything. I logged, topside. 16:21 local time. The light is doing something. I don't have an entry for this. Then, I logged, we're okay. It was the first time I had used that construction. I noticed it after I typed it and left it. The debrief happened 18 hours later, after the medical clearances and the structural assessments and the rounds of administrative procedure that follow any significant incident in a joint operation. Veilshan, I have been writing in third person occasionally. I will now return to it. Veilshan of the 4th Expeditionary sat across a table from 2 of her superiors and 1 coalition liaison and gave a complete after-action account. The 2 superiors asked technical questions. The coalition liaison asked technical questions. She answered all of them accurately. She did not editorialize. At the end, one of her superiors, Commander Veith, who had been her commanding officer for 4 years and who communicated primarily in the form of rhetorical questions that were not actually questions, said, "The human corporal's oxygen management during the extraction phase was irregular. She appears to have been significantly past safe reserve by the time the rescue team made contact." Yes, Veilshan said. She chose to expend reserve on a communication attempt rather than conserving for rescue window. Yes. Was this consistent with Coalition field protocol? Veilshan considered this. I don't know what Coalition field protocol specifies for this scenario. I know what Corporal Solis did. Commander Veith looked at her for a moment. And? She made contact. Gave them our position and the access route. That's why the rescue team reached us when they did and not later. She paused. My gauge had 4% remaining when they arrived, Commander. Veith was quiet for a moment. You're saying she prioritized your survival window over her own reserve? Veilshan had thought about this for 18 hours. She had thought about it in the medical bay, during the clearance procedures, in the brief window of sleep she had managed, which had been for the first time, and she didn't want to count how long, not interrupted by the sound of her own oxygen gauge in her dreams. I don't think that's exactly how she thought about it, she said. Veith raised an eyebrow. The Kethor equivalent. I think she thought about what needed to happen and did it, Veilshan said. I think the oxygen window was a constraint she was managing, not a priority hierarchy she was navigating. She didn't make a decision to sacrifice her own safety for mine. She made a series of decisions about what actions had the best probability of both of us surviving. The reserve management was part of that. So was the cooking. A silence. The cooking, the coalition liaison said. She constructed a heating apparatus and prepared rations in the first cavity, Veilshan said. At hour 6. While my oxygen was at 64% and the probability of rescue in our window was not favorable. Why? Veilshan had been asking herself this for 24 hours. She had been asking it since hour 6, when the smell hit her and something had shifted that she hadn't been able to name. I think, she said carefully, that she was maintaining the conditions for thinking clearly. Her own and mine. She paused. Or she was. I don't know. She didn't explain it. She thought of Solis's face, of the flat attention, the undramatic precision, the way she had said we'll figure something out and then proceeded to figure something out without ever broadcasting the effort. The way she'd slept 4 hours like a tool, woken up already working, built a heating apparatus, explored a mine shaft, corrected Veilshan's grip, guided her suit through a tight passage, made contact with rescue services, and then sat with her back against a conduit array and pulled out the second ration pack and put it back.
Save it. For after.
She was accurate, Veilshan said. She said we'd figure something out.
She was accurate.
She asked to see Solis before the debrief closed out. This was slightly irregular. Post-incident protocols separated personnel from their immediate context for a period following a significant event, but Veilshan had been told, at multiple points in her career, that she had a relationship with protocol that could charitably be described as flexible, and she exercised the flexibility.
Solis was in the medical bay.
Her shoulder had been scanned, a clean fracture in the secondary socket, the kind that heals with a brace and time, the kind that would have made the work in the cavity considerably more painful than Solis had expressed at any point during the cavity. She was sitting on a medical table in a fracture brace with a foil-sealed coffee packet in her hands, looking at it with the expression she used for things she was assessing.
Not the emergency ones.
Just a regular thing, examined with full attention.
The coffee was from the mess unit. Veilshan knew the mess unit's coffee.
It was terrible. How's the shoulder? Veilshan said.
Clean break.
2 weeks. Solis looked up.
You're cleared?
Medically.
Still in debrief.
She stood in the doorway of the medical bay and looked at Solis with the shoulder brace and the terrible coffee and the face.
You had a fractured shoulder in the cavity.
Solis looked at her.
For 3 hours of sealing work, Veilshan said. Yeah. You didn't mention it.
Solis tilted her head slightly.
Would it have changed the work? Veilshan did not answer this immediately.
She thought about it the way she thought about everything that Solis produced, which was, run the implications.
Would it have changed the work? No. Would Veilshan have felt differently about what Solis was contributing to the work? Yes. Would Solis have wanted her to feel differently? Probably not.
No, she said. It wouldn't have changed the work.
Then.
Solis looked at her coffee.
That was all. Then.
Veilshan came into the medical bay and sat on the bench across from the table. Solis peeled back the foil on the coffee and looked at the contents with a face that Veilshan had learned to read, over 11 weeks and one significantly formative mind collapse, as the reality is consistent with expectations, and the expectations were not favorable. That coffee is terrible, Veilshan said.
Yeah, Solis said. She drank some of it.
Veilshan looked at her. At this person who had a fractured shoulder and a 2-week recovery ahead of her and a terrible coffee and who had, in the last 31 hours, built a stove, descended a mine shaft twice, worked sealing aggregate for 3 hours, and made contact with rescue services at significant personal risk, all of which she had accomplished without a speech or a declaration, or anything that Veilshan's training would have recognized as performed heroism, which was the category she kept reaching for and kept not finding the right fit. She was trying to find the word. She had been trying to find it since hour 6.
Not optimism.
She'd established that early.
Optimism was statistically illiterate.
Solis wasn't.
Not courage.
Courage implied a cost, and Solis didn't seem to experience the costs as costs, she seemed to experience them as the arithmetic of the situation, the numbers on one side of the ledger.
Not stubbornness.
Stubbornness was the refusal to update.
Solis updated constantly.
She assessed, she adjusted, she discarded options that didn't work and pursued options that might.
Not loyalty.
There had been nothing in their interaction that required loyalty. They were joint-op counterparts. They had a procedural relationship and a functional obligation and a collapsed mine.
That was all.
Can I ask you something? Veilshan said. Solis looked at her over the coffee.
Go ahead. The ration packs. The camp stove fuel. The heating apparatus. She paused. Why?
Solis looked at her for a moment. Because we needed to eat, she said.
We needed to survive. Caloric intake from one ration pack was not the determining variable in we needed to eat, Solis said again. Not defensively.
Just precisely.
Like she was making a distinction that mattered. There's what you need to survive and there's what you need to keep thinking. They're not the same thing. Veilshan sat with this.
You were keeping us functional, she said.
I was making dinner, Solis said. Those are not, I know, Solis said. She looked at the coffee. They're both true. Veilshan filed the after-action report. She filed it 3 times, because Command sent it back twice, and she rewrote it each time with the same information, and Command continued to suggest it read like fiction, and she continued to reply that this was the human's fault, and they continued to agree that this was probably true. She requested a transfer extension on the joint operation. The request was reviewed and approved, and she received a message from Commander Veith that said, approved. Please try not to get buried in anything else. She logged this, Veith humor. Noted.
On the morning she reported back to the joint operation compound, she brought a communication package from the Kethra supply officer, a small thing, a courtesy, the kind of formal exchange the 4th Expeditionary did with Allied units. Technically, though the word tea was doing significant work to cover a wider range of Kethra beverage preparations than the word could comfortably contain. She put it on the equipment table in the comms unit where Solis worked, without announcing it, without ceremony, because she had been paying attention and she understood now that the transaction completed itself. She did not wait to see if Solis found it. She went to work. 3 days later, she was running a routine systems check on the joint relay station, back to the regular operations, back to the administrative weight of liaison work, back to filing reports and managing the particular friction that accumulated when 2 militaries tried to occupy the same infrastructure without shooting each other when she heard Solis say something across the comms room that she did not catch in full. Just the last word. She looked over. Solis was on a frequency call with the coalition station, going through some technical calibration, and she had said something that ended in right, exactly, we'll figure it out. She had the same tone she'd had in the first cavity. The same flat certainty. The same quality that sat underneath the words like a load-bearing strut. Veilshan looked at the relay board for a moment. She had been trying, since hour 6 in that cavity, to find the word. She had been trying for 4 days, across 2 rewrites of an after-action report and several nights of variable sleep and 1 very long conversation with Veith in which she had mostly not talked about the thing she was actually trying to understand. She typed it into the log. Not a report, this time. Just the log. Just the medicinal one. Entry 119. I have been trying to identify what Solis has that I don't have a word for. I have been working through my rejection of the obvious candidates' optimism, courage, stubbornness, loyalty, and I think the reason none of them fit is that they are all about a relationship to outcome. Being brave about a bad outcome. Being loyal despite a costly outcome. Being stubborn in the face of a possible outcome. Solis doesn't appear to have a relationship to outcome at all. Or, not that she doesn't care. She clearly cares. But, she doesn't seem to organize her behavior around a prediction of the outcome. She organizes it around the work itself. Around what needs doing right now, in this space, with what's available. The outcome is downstream of the work. The work is what you control. So you work. She paused. I am aware this is a known philosophy. I am aware I could identify it as stoicism or pragmatism or a number of other labeled frameworks. I don't think that's what it is. I think those are the frameworks you reach for when you're trying to describe it from the outside. From the inside, I think it feels like you still have hands, and there's still stone to move, and that is the whole equation. She looked at the log. She thought about the smell of the ration pack in the small cavity, 40 meters underground, the warmth of the container through her glove. She thought about we'll figure something out and, then, they had. She added 1 line, the word I was looking for was, present. She closed the log. Across the room, Solis finished her calibration call, checked the board, noted something on her handheld, reached for the Kethra tea she had found it, then, and, pulled the seal, and, looked at the contents, and, made the face. It was not, Veilshan thought, a promising face. Solis drank it anyway. Veilshan opened the log again. Added, also she finished the tea. I don't know what to do with this either.
filing under unknown. She closed it. She went back to work. Transmission ends. Filed under Joint Op Drevith Incident 447G Classification, Standard. Status, third attempt. Command note, fine. We'll keep it.